Hi, this is Jim of Shiloh Kahal. I want to address what I've come across that may be a significant stumbling block in the discussion of Leviticus 23 as evidence for when a day begins and ends. Um, as I was reading with somebody and addressing some of what I'm sharing, I realized that we struggled and we hit a point, a block of communication. And let me explain what I mean by that. Okay, so here is Leviticus 23, and I've chosen the New King James Version, but pick your version. I don't, really doesn't matter. This is New King James, where we're talking about the Day of Atonement. Day of Atonement here. Um, and we do talk about the seventh day, but let me go to the passage that's in question, in verse 32, where it reads like this: It is to be a Sabbath of solemn rest. And we're talking at this point in time, we're talking about the 10th day. It is to be a Sabbath of solemn rest. So the word in question is Sabbath and rest. Those are the words in question that I am offering to you, that on the 10th day, we are to have a Sabbath of rest. I contend that that's all that it is. I'll come back to, well, I guess I'll take a moment here to explain. In this context, when we have a lowercase Sabbath like that, Sabbath as a definition is just a period of rest, a time of rest. How long the period of rest is or the time of rest is entirely dependent upon what context tells you the Sabbath is. We know that on the seventh day Sabbath, it's a whole day. And we actually capitalize it and turn it into a proper noun of Sabbath, which I'll show you in a moment here. But in the context of a proper noun, the Sabbath, the seventh day, which we call the Sabbath, that's clearly a 24-hour period of time. We know that whole day is a Sabbath. And I think that's confusing our issues here. It goes on to say, and you shall afflict your souls. And then here's the instruction that is that's just in conflict, where it reads like this: On the 9th day of the month, at evening, from evening to evening, you shall celebrate your Sabbath. When people are reading this, especially if they've been told or influenced that the day goes from evening to evening, you read into this discussion the concept of the day. But that's not what is happening here. And let me see if I can explain. On the 9th day of the month at evening, first of all, we're on the 9th day, at evening, from evening, you shall celebrate your Sabbath. All we've done is created that we're going to, the explicit instruction here. Well, here, let me pull up I've taken it, New King James Version, and I've put it on this Word doc, Word doc, and here's the passage. It shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest, and you shall afflict your souls. On the 9th day of the month at evening, from evening to evening, you shall celebrate your Sabbath. Okay, so the only explicit, and what does explicit mean? When we get into definitions, explicit means stated clearly and in detail with no room for confusion or doubt. The only explicit instruction we got out of verse 32 here is that on the 9th day of the month, or actually, because they inserted the day, I've actually taken it out. So on the 9th of the month at evening, from evening to evening, you shall celebrate your Sabbath. So the explicit instruction, and all it does is it defines that we are to keep a Sabbath, which is a time of rest, and we are to start it on the 9th at evening, and then that period of rest is to go, after starting at evening here, is to go from evening to evening. That is the only explicit instruction that we got. So this Sabbath, this period of rest, begins at evening on the 9th of the month and runs from evening to evening. That's all that we got. Anything else that we bring into this, if we introduce that this passage up here is defining a day, well, it doesn't say anything about it. There's no word about a day beginning to end. In fact, let me just say a possible explicit instruction, if it were defining a day, would read something like, at the end of the 9th of the month, at evening, when the 10th begins, from the beginning of day 10 to the end of day 10, With something like that, we would have known unequivocally when when the ninth is introduced, it would tell us it's at the end of day 9, which is what everybody's inferring by that passage. But that's what they're doing. They're inferring or saying that there's implicit, not explicit, but implicit instruction, or they're inferring information into it. But had it read something like at the end of the ninth or ninth day, whatever you want, of the month, we would have known that it's at the end and not the ninth in an evening to evening discussion. And then it goes on, if it had gone on to read at evening, when the 10th begins, because in an evening to evening discussion, that's when the day begins. If it had said at evening, when the 10th begins, and then from the beginning of the 10th of day 10 or the 10th day to the end of day 10, we are to celebrate our Sabbath. Had it said something like that, that would have been explicit instruction. But when we're left with this, on the 9th day of the month, at evening to evening, you shall celebrate your Sabbath. The only explicit instruction, again, is that we are to keep a period of rest that starts in the evening on the 9th and goes until evening comes around again. That's the only implicit or explicit instruction that we've received. So why are we confusing then? Because what seems to be happening is that when people read that passage, it's almost like they cannot help it. They are reading into this passage that this last portion of it on the 9th day is clearly saying that the day begins with evening and runs to the evening. And then they have to find a way to justify it according to, they have to find a way to justify it according to an evening to evening, which they think this is defining the day. And since from evening to evening is defining the day according to them, then we've got to find a way to make the 9th day at evening in an evening to evening day, which is what they're arguing for. You've got to find a way to make the evening of day 9 the end of day 9. Got to do it. Let me go to the definition of Sabbath, because when we see, and here's Merriam-Webster's, we've got a capital S for Sabbath, and typically, a noun that is capitalized can either be the beginning of a sentence or it could be a proper noun. In this case, this is a proper noun. What makes Sabbath, which is a noun and really just a time of rest, what makes it a proper noun? Well, if you apply it to the 7th day of the week as observed from Friday evening to Saturday evening as a day of rest by some Jews and Christians, or some day observed by Christians as a day of worship. First of all, there's more pushing people into an evening to evening, which is that question. This is the argument that are we really supposed to be doing evening to evening or morning to morning? But when you turn it into this particular day, whether it's evening to evening or morning to morning, you turn it into the 7th day of the week. Yeah, it's now a Sabbath, because we all know that when we say Sabbath, we're also talking about the 7th day. We've turned it into a proper noun. We could do the same thing with Sunday as observed by Christians on a day of rest, or we could do it with other religions who are keeping a Sabbath, etc. But really, what is a Sabbath if you make it lowercase? It's a time of rest. Again, it's just dependent. That time of rest is entirely dependent upon context. Let me give you a further example right here in Merriam-Webster's, where they are taking Sabbath and tying sabbatical and Sabbath together, because people tend to know what a sabbatical is. I shouldn't say that. They presume that they know what a sabbatical is. Usually it's thought of in academic terms. Let me just read this to you and see if we can apply this to what I'm saying. We tend to think of sabbatical in academic terms as a school year free from teaching duties that can be devoted to research, travel, and writing. Traditionally, this occurs every 7th year. Because of this scholarly context, we may easily miss what is hiding in plain sight, that sabbatical is related to Sabbath, which refers to the biblical day of rest. See how they've got Sabbath in caps? It's a proper noun at that point in time, which is the biblical day of rest, or the 7th day. And then they go on to say, we trace the origins of both sabbatical and Sabbath to the Greek word sabbaton, and sabbaton itself traces to the Hebrew word Shabbat, which means to rest. So when we back in Sabbath, that we have taken to mean this proper seventh day, or we turn it into a proper noun. When we back it all the way back to Sabbath, which is why we will see in some of our scriptures one of the Sabbaths in lowercase, one of the Sabbaths. It's not a proper noun. It's just a definition of a period of rest. So when we are going lowercase for Sabbath, it's really just Shabbat, and it just means rest, which is this definition here, a time of rest. So going back to Leviticus, all that we are talking about is day 10 is to be a Sabbath, a day, a time of rest for us. And it's a solemn rest. And we are to afflict our souls in this celebration of this Sabbath rest. And when does it begin? It begins on the 9th day of the month at evening. The Sabbath begins at evening. Not a day. This Sabbath or solemn rest begins at evening and runs from evening to evening. And we shall celebrate our lowercase Sabbath, our time of rest. Again, and there's nothing in here to define a day. Nothing in here is saying that it is telling us a day begins or ends. Okay, so let's apply this to our day analysis. They're saying that it clearly that evening to evening, that ba'areb, this evening to evening clearly says ba'areb to ba'areb, or it's really me'areb, add areb. But either way, from evening to evening is defining for us clearly, unequivocally, explicitly even. I mean, some are going so far as to say explicit, but certainly many are saying that clearly, with clarity, to define what clearly means, clearly in a clear manner, with clarity, that this is teaching. Not, if not explicitly, although some are saying that it's explaining in a clear and detailed manner, leaving no room for doubt or confusion. Even if it's not that, we don't go that far, they're saying that it is implicit, which is suggested though not directly expressed, and that it is inferred, which is derived at by reasoning or concluded by evidence or provisionally identified. So whether explicit or implicit or inferred, it's all good enough for people who are saying that this evening to evening is evidence that a day runs from evening to evening. I'm contending that's not what the scripture has nothing to do with that. But if they were to take this and then they would apply this follow-up, which is if you go back, okay, so from evening to evening, but you have to then go back to the 9th day of the month at evening. Now you have the 9th day, which should be, when we go with the evening and we have evening to evening, the 9th day at evening should be, or the evening of the 9th day should be the first thing that happens. So let me explain that in a picture if I can. So here it'd be, if in evening to evening, here's the evening over here. Give me a second. Sorry, I've pulled up a PDF document that I can mark up here, and let me do so. Okay, so if we were going to in an evening to evening explanation, then the evening starts the day, and so you could say that the evening is when the sun, if this is the horizon here, this blue line, you have this opportunity that maybe when the sun, the orb of the sun, the bottom of the sun, touches the horizon, but none of it's obscure. You can make that argument. And then you have this period of time right here where potentially you have the orb of the sun, the entire sun has already gone through, and now the last vestige of the light of the sun disappears and we have the sunset. So we could have the sun setting completely but above the horizon with no obscurity touching the horizon, or we could have the sun completely below the horizon where all the light has gone past the horizon and it's still touching on the other side. You could claim either one of those. You could even claim the process of the sun touching with no obscurity, touching the horizon, and then the process as it moves through the horizon, it becomes partially obscured, then halfway obscured, then 3/4 obscured to totally obscured, which 2 to 6 minutes, I've heard different things. So you could have this process which would run between this and this. Oops, I'm sorry. Here to here, you can have that process. It doesn't matter. But whatever you define it, it should be the beginning of a day. If evening to evening, if ba'areb to ba'areb is your definition of an evening. Everything It gets complicated when you say the passage teaches us evening to evening, and then we have that our Sabbath begins on day 9 at evening, because that places us somewhere here. On day 9, places us somewhere here in the beginning of the day. And then if it's the beginning of the day and we're to keep the Sabbath, basically from this evening to the next evening, we're going to keep the Sabbath until we reach, the same thing here, this evening here, which would then be the day 10 start. To make it work, people are saying, and they're having to basically say, yeah. The start of the day is evening, but in the case of talking about day 9, they must be talking about the end of day 9 when the sun is getting ready to touch, or maybe this process, it really doesn't matter. But they're basically saying when we're talking about day 9 here, on the 9th day at evening, when we're talking about that, it must be talking about the end of the evening. But that stands juxtaposed and in direct contradiction with the evening to evening start of the day. So they're saying that the end of the day 9 at even, when it's used that way, must be this, which is the end of the daylight period of time on day 9. And then basically they're saying day 9 ends here and we begin immediately day 10. But in an evening to evening of day 10 is starting it. So we have evening of day 9 ending day 9 and beginning day 9. And then we have the evening of day 10 beginning the day of day 10. So we have all of this conflated. And that stands in contrast to morning, where I don't have to conflate any of it. In a morning to morning day, we begin day 9. We could talk about all kinds of reasons why morning to morning just makes sense in observance, and evening to evening is confusing at best. But if day 9 started in the morning, well, we enter the day here when the sun rises. We go 12 hours of period of time, and then we reach evening. And at this point, I really don't care if we want to talk about, the sun orbs touching the bottom of the horizon with the entire orb of the sun above the horizon, or if the entire sun has moved below the horizon and the last vestige of light has disappeared, but just right in the moment where it has disappeared, that last piece of the light of the sun is gone and now it's all entirely below the horizon, or even this process. Or even this process between the two. It really wouldn't matter at this point in time. I mean, it might, because basically we are commanded then to at even begin our Sabbath. And if you're not sure, start your Sabbath when the sun's orb is touching the horizon. Be safe. Be conservative. Just stop doing any work on that day when the orb touches the horizon. And then it really doesn't matter if the actual start of the day or start of the evening would have been once the sun went down, or the process. It really doesn't matter at that point in time. But what we do know is that if in this illustration, on the 9th day of the month at evening looks like this. Looks like this. The 9th day of the month at evening, this period of time here, we are to begin our Sabbath, which starts here with this evening. And we are to keep this period of rest, complete rest, until the next evening. It doesn't say explicitly day 10. It doesn't say, it just says, what it says explicitly is on day 9 at evening, we are to keep a period of rest that runs from evening to evening. That is all that is explicitly said. And in this context, then we were to run this Sabbath, and the Sabbath then crosses into the daylight period. This is the Day of Atonement on day 10. And throughout the daylight periods of day 10, we are to definitely keep the Sabbath, definitely, because it's still in that period of evening to evening, Sabbath period. So there's no question we need to keep a solemn Sabbath, day of rest. We are resting through all of the daylight hours here. Now, when we reach evening, has the Sabbath ended? I don't know. I'm not going to try and say ended here, but does the Sabbath end here? It looks like the implicit instruction would be, yeah, it ends. I mean, I suppose if it had said if it had gone on to say we are to keep our evening to evening, we are to keep our Sabbath, and then if it went on to say, but then at evening of day 10, the Sabbath has ended, that would have been explicit. But without that, all we can do is say it seems implicit and then infer. And in that moment, we're all, in the lack of explicit instructions, we're all inferring and taking implicit direction, things that are not necessarily clear. So I would say in this environment, we have period of rest here from this evening to that evening, the daylight hours for sure. And then technically we don't continue the Sabbath into the nighttime. Could you work or do something else or stop doing the things that are commanded? Maybe, but if you want to be conservative, which I tend to do, why bother? Just continue the Sabbath. Just continue it on in through the night. So I would say if you want to be conservative, we're going to start our Sabbath as soon as that sun is touching the horizon, and I'm going to keep it until I wake up the next day and the sun's up. That's how I will make sure that I am keeping the Day of Atonement, Sabbath. Well, let's compare, because these are both offered as, I get people who are saying, oh, it's clear. It's explicit or implicit or clear inference that evening to evening is the instruction of Leviticus 23, verses 26 through 32. And I'm saying that morning to morning is the inference or the implicit instruction. Let's employ Occam's razor to this. What is Occam's razor? I mean, I don't know if you can read it here, but generally speaking, over here, according to Wikipedia, Occam's razor is pretty much the problem-solving principle. It's the problem-solving principle that recommends searching for the explanations constructed with the smallest set of elements, also known as the principle of parsimony, or the parsimony, or the law of parsimony. Okay, so that's technical, and we could keep reading here, but if we go down here, we'll see what is commonly. This is the common understanding, and this is Duke University, but it really doesn't matter. Here is the common understanding of the principle of Occam's razor. It's the principle of parsimony that tells us that the simplest, most eloquent explanation is usually the one closest to the truth. If I employ that to this discussion, I would say I have all kinds of problems, and this is not simple in an evening to evening. When we say that this evening to evening is defining for us the day. When we say that's that's when a day is defined, and that then we start trying to explain away day 9 according to this, we end up with this, and it's not simple. If you explain it away as the day beginning in the morning, that this has nothing to do with defining a day, only to do with defining when we are to keep our Sabbath, which is what it explicitly says. You shall celebrate your Sabbath from evening to evening. That's all it explicitly says, and that it begins at evening. But if we leave this evening to define the period of time for our rest, our Sabbath, if that's all that is, and we don't try to conflate the day, and this is what people are seeing and bringing into it. They're conflating that this somehow is talking about the beginning and ending of a day. And that scripture it doesn't. There's nothing there about the beginning and end of the day. So if we don't let that become conflated, and we already know that a day starts in the morning and runs from the morning, and we understand that this evening to evening has nothing to do with the beginning of the day that started in the morning, but rather just defines when we keep the Sabbath, which begins on the 9th day at evening, and then we keep the Sabbath of rest from evening to evening, and celebrate our Sabbath from evening to evening, starting with day 9. I'm sorry, but that to me is Occam's razor. That is the simplest explanation. So, in summary, Leviticus 23 does not support evening to evening. If you read in that wording, evening to evening, ba'areb, as if it says ba'areb instead of me'areb, ad areb, and you receive it as ba'areb to ba'areb, and it's clear, implicit, explicit, clear inference, and you treat that as some sort of reference to the beginning and ending of the day, you're going to be confused. And there's no reason to bring it in except for preconceptions, a preconceived notice or idea that the day starts in the evening. So that as soon as you see evening to evening, because people have told you a day starts evening to evening, you begin to think of it as evening to evening. And because the proper noun of day 7, they've taught you, just like they did in Merriam-Webster here, they're teaching you that it runs from evening to evening. So you are starting with this perspective. It's tainting your clear, unequivocal read of Leviticus 23. If you would just remove all this idea that we're talking about a day and we're talking about a Sabbath like a proper name, evening to evening, like they have wrongly, in my opinion, defined it, but giving you preconceived notions. If you remove all of that from Leviticus 23, you have explicit instruction, simple instruction that on the 9th day at evening and then from evening to evening, you are to celebrate your Sabbath and leave it there. That's it. Don't pull in the day. And if you do that, then Occam's razor says that morning to morning makes it all work. This is so much easier than this. And this morning to morning is Occam's razor and most likely to be the truth. All right. I hope I have successfully made a point to you. Thank you, and may you be